Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Plenty happening in the world of federal politics. On the global stage, the fallout continues after the government cancelled a contract with France for conventional submarines in favour of a deal for nuclear subs with the US and UK. The Prime Minister is now in the United States for talks with President Joe Biden and the leaders of India and Japan, the newly formed Quad, with China high on the agenda. Back home, the ongoing controversy involving former Attorney General Christian Porter came to a head when he resigned from the front bench over the weekend. That all happened after he received $1 million in a blind trust to pay legal fees in a defamation case against the ABC. All of this with an election only months away. Laura Tingle is the chief political correspondent for ABC 730. Laura, welcome back.
Hi, Sean.
Very big couple of weeks for Scott Morrison, particularly on the global stage. What's your take on the submarine debate?
Look, this has been a strategic decision, which is basically saying we're not going to be able to improve things with China. We've got to sort of step up and sort of show that, we're not scared. And it's supposed to be about giving us our own sort of much more aggressive capacity to front China. But in fact, it does the opposite. It basically deprives us of any sovereign capability in the submarine fleet for an extra 10 years. And I think sort of overlooked in all of this was the announcement made by Peter Dutton a few hours after the submarine announcement that he was expecting in the future for there to be more US troops, for US planes to be stationed here, US submarines to be stationed here, and US missiles to be stationed here. So, it's a full embrace of American foreign policy and defence policy, if you like. And it's really, to use the colloquial phrase, really pissed off the French.
It certainly has. I mean, is the cost to our relations with China and France worth it?
Well, as I said, I think, the pragmatic call, which is probably correct, is that it was probably fairly unsalvageable, the China relationship under the current regime.
Yep.
So, they probably think, well, there's not much to lose there, though, people who do business in China may see that differently. I think there's a lot of talk about how, this was always going to be a tough thing to do. And, of course, the French are upset and, but there's not really, a nice way to leave your lover sort of thing. But I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. When you talk to people who've been involved in this, the extent to which not just the French government, but Naval Group and a whole range of smaller companies in Australia and France are adversely affected by this and which were receiving assurances that everything was peachy right up until, a week before the announcement or even days in some cases. So, there are small companies in South Australia and elsewhere around Australia that have made big investments of plant and equipment in the expectation of this submarine arrangement coming to fruition. So it's not just a question of, a few French diplomats and politicians being upset about this. There's real world consequences in all of this. So, I think you would have tried to put a little bit more effort into, signalling it. And instead, the French, I think, feel that Naval Group has been maligned as an unreliable contractor when that's not the evidence, and that they've just been betrayed when they felt that they had moved beyond the old European connections to make a real and lasting connection with Australia and the Indo-Pacific, which is a place which Emmanuel Macron takes very, very seriously.
Okay, and just before we leave this topic, do you think there will be broader ramifications for trade deals in Europe?
Oh, look, I think there will be. I mean, I'm not saying it will scuttle the FTA, but it will certainly, I don't think anybody's going to be in a great rush to move it ahead. And I think there are also other questions as well, Sean. For example, one of the outcomes of this deal is that we will be relying on our Collins-class submarines for a lot longer.
Yeah.
And we need a few new gadgets to do that, like speedos or something, some technical thing. And guess where they're supposed to come from? So, I don't think the French would be that peevish, but it does have lots of ramifications.
Okay, on to China. Whilst all this was going on, China gave Wellington a ring in New Zealand and asked to join a regional trade deal with Australia and New Zealand and other countries in the region. What do you make of that?
Well, this is sort of interesting. I don't claim to be sort of across all the ins and outs of it, but New Zealand has been criticised by a lot of other countries for being too forward-leaning, if you like, towards China.
Yep.
So it probably, and they've tended to sort of just withdraw from that a little bit in the last couple of years. Some of the other Five Eyes partners, like Australia, have warned New Zealand that, there are security risks involved here and that they should just probably take a sort of a step backwards. But without a doubt, New Zealand was one of the first countries to sign an FTA with China, and it's obviously now seen as a bit of a target for China, making sure it can get into the Pacific in a really economically engaged way.
So how important are these talks with the US, the Quad leaders? That seems to be quite a forceful grouping at the moment in the region.
Look, it is a forceful grouping. Once again, it's sort of an unusual one, and I think you've got to sort of look at the awkwardly named AUKUS alliance in the context of the Quad, the fact that we do have this other relationship that's formed with Japan and India,
Yep.
as well as the US. I mean, I think having these meetings obviously is, once again, it's a bit of a show of force. It's about sending messages out. What the Quad actually represents in reality is not all that clear. It's let's all have our play lunch together, but there's not anything really substantive in the arrangement as yet. But it's an important symbolic sign, and it'll be interesting to see whether it develops into something more substantive.
Okay, stay with me, Laura. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Laura Tingle, Chief Political Correspondent for ABC 730. Okay, bringing you back home, Christian Porter, he resigned on the weekend over the blind trust issue. I mean, it's not going to go away for the government. How much of a drag is it, do you think, in the run-up to the next election, which has to be before May next year?
It certainly doesn't help. I'm a bit surprised that Christian Porter is saying he's going to recontest, which of course he's entitled to do, his seat of Pearce. So the Parliament is due to come back in October, presuming it does, and that Scott Morrison doesn't decide to have a pre-Christmas election. It will be just an ongoing issue which does go to the transparency of the government, because while the Prime Minister and Christian Porter are essentially saying, well, he wasn't meeting ministerial declaration standards or was unable to satisfy the Prime Minister because he couldn't tell him where the money was coming from, that he was meeting the ministerial standards, there is a remaining issue about his declaration of interests as an MP. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. One of them is that he has not fulfilled the declaration of interests in spirit or in practice, which is about telling people where your money is coming from or where it's invested in and what the source of it has been. There's this alternative view that's come up in the last few days that, in fact, the black letter of the Declaration of Interests doesn't require you to say where the money's coming from. But I don't think, as they say, that would pass the pub test, because essentially that would mean saying that, it's fine for an MP to get up to $1 million from people that you're not going to disclose. And, it's a terrible look. And I think it's indefensible, whatever the technicalities might be.
Yeah. Do you have a view of when the election will be?
Look, I'm still plumping for the first quarter of the year, a March election. Every so often there's a bit of a frisson around the place about the possibility that Scott Morrison will punt everything and go early, just call it, say, mid-October for December, just as the case numbers are starting to decline. And the main argument for that seems to be, well, you do that because it's only going to get worse later on. But it still seems like a very high-risk strategy to me.
So just a couple of other issues quickly. The vaccine rollout, it certainly seems to be better for the government than it has been.
It certainly has finally ramped up and people are getting vaccinated. The issues of this are, whether people will forget, the fact that their businesses have been closed for months and months and that they're blaming Scott Morrison for that because the vaccine rollout was slow. That was certainly the view in focus groups and things a month or two ago, that it was clearly seen that the economic shutdown was due to his mistakes.
Yep.
So that's working much better for the government than it was, without a doubt. But we've also got this sort of anti-vaxxer fringe, and there's still a question about the extent to which that actually starts to result in a tapering off of vaccination rates, as we've seen in other countries at a certain point. Though you'd have to say the numbers so far are encouraging for us getting, to sort of 80% in most parts of the country.
Yeah. Climate change, with the United Nations COP conference in November in Glasgow, do you think climate change will play a role in the next election?
Well, I think it will. And you can see by things like Dave Sharma, the member for Wentworth, coming out and starting to do a bit of product differentiation on emissions reduction, the sign that there are people who are nervous. There is a lot of talk of less conservative MPs pressuring the Prime Minister on this. I don't have great hopes that he's going to sort of, have some Damascus conversion on the issue, but I think it will still play a role. Probably not as big a role, Sean, as it might have a few months ago before we had the outbreaks of COVID in New South Wales and Victoria. I think those outbreaks and the scars they have left on a lot of people and their businesses do change the equation of where the seats will be won and lost.
And then just quickly, the Aged Care Royal Commission, I know I've spoken to you about this before. It seems to have been lost somewhat as a result of COVID primarily, but there was a lot in that which actually didn't make anyone look real good, including Greg Hunt, the health minister. Do you think that will play any role?
Well, for people with, as they say, the lived experience of aged care, I think it will. But as you say, there's so much noise around. Who can say?
So will Anthony Albanese, can he actually win the next election?
Well, it's always a question primarily of whether the government can lose it. I think there are, once again, there are questions about, one of the things about the submarine deal is it may not have wedged Labor, but it's sort of silenced them because they just don't want to be talking about national security issues. So that sort of keeps them a little bit in their box. I don't know whether national security is actually an issue that's going to work for Scott Morrison. And I think it is much more going to be a seat-by-seat proposition, particularly with the rise of a lot of these independent candidates. I think it's not going to be the thing that where Anthony Albanese wins because everybody goes, yay, we want Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister at this point. It will be sort of a bit of an accidental result, and they don't happen all that much.
Yeah, I mean, there's no talk of Anthony or being replaced by anyone?
Not really, no.
Fair enough. Laura, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean. Always a pleasure.
That was Laura Tingle, Chief Political Correspondent for ABC 730. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.